Yeah, that sounds about right for me. It's been, well, let's just say more than a couple of years since I made a choice that I can't stop replaying in my mind. Some days, I even convince myself I'm over it, that I'm past the worst of the guilt. Then something stupid, like a song or a smell or someone laughing in a certain way, brings it all rushing back. Just a reminder, you know, of the ways I managed to mess up. The thing is, I wasn't unhappy when it all started. That's the part one keep getting stuck on. My relationship wasn't bad. I mean, it had its rough patches, but whose doesn't? There were those mornings we'd sit across from each other, still groggy from sleep, sipping coffee in comfortable silence. And I'd think, this is it. This is what being settled feels like. And I really thought that was enough for me. But there's this other part of me, one I'm not super proud of, that craves excitement. The thrill of something new. I don't know if that's an excuse or a character flaw, or maybe both. But whatever it is, it got the best of me when I least expected it. It started with someone I worked with. Let's call her Emily. She wasn't flashy or anything, just interesting. She had this way of talking, like she was holding back a smirk, always in on a joke you didn't know about yet. We'd end up in meetings together, sitting on opposite sides of the room, and I'd catch her looking at me with that slight smile. Nothing big, just enough to make me wonder if she saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself anymore. It was like a spark in a room full of cold, and I couldn't ignore it. I told myself it was harmless. Everyone flirts a little, right? Just makes the day more bearable. But it didn't stay harmless for long. One afternoon, we were both working late, the office practically empty, and she asked if I wanted to grab a drink to wind down. It didn't feel like a big deal. We'd both been working hard. Both needed a break. But, it was one of those moments where I felt that little pang, that maybe this isn't the best idea voice in the back of my head. And I ignored it. We went to this low-key bar around the corner, the kind of place that's dimly lit with worn leather booze and a bartender who doesn't ask too many questions. Emily and I slid into a booth, and suddenly, it was like I was seeing her in a whole new light. She was funny, sharp, and she had this way of tilting her head when she listened to me that made me feel like the most interesting guy in the world. I hadn't felt like that in a while. After a few drinks, things started to feel fuzzy, in that good way, where everything seems simpler than it really is. I remember laughing more than I had in a long time. I remember her hand grazing mine on the table, and that electric jolt it sent up my arm. I'd almost forgotten what that felt like. The thrill of newness, of possibility. When we left the bar, she offered me a ride home. My car was back at the office, and I could have gone to get it, but I didn't. I slid into her passenger seat, and it was quiet, the streetlights blurring as we drove. We talked about little things, about work, about music, avoiding anything too personal, like we were balancing on a knife's edge. She pulled up to my building, and for a moment, there was just this heavy silence. Neither of us made a move to get out or say goodbye. I don't know who leaned in first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was her. But suddenly, we were kissing, and everything I thought I knew about myself went out the window. I don't know how long we stayed like that, tangled up in each other, in the glow of the dashboard lights. When I finally pulled away, the weight of what I'd done started to settle in, this sick feeling in my stomach. But at the same time, I felt more alive than I had in ages. After that night, things changed in ways I didn't even recognize at first. You think you can compartmentalize stuff like this, keep it neat and separate from the rest of your life. But those lines I thought I could draw, they blurred fast. I'd be sitting with my partner at home, maybe watching some dumb show together, and out of nowhere, Emily would pop into my head. I'd remember the taste of her lip gloss, or the way she tilted her head and looked at me, and this wave of guilt would hit so hard it felt physical. But even then, there was this sick little thrill mixed in, like some part of me wanted to get caught, like I was testing fate. It was a few weeks later when we actually crossed the line. After that night in the car, I kept telling myself it was a one-off thing. But Emily and I still worked together, still saw each other almost every day, and she wasn't backing off. She didn't seem to feel any guilt, or if she did, she hid it well. She'd still flash that knowing smile across the room in meetings, or brush her hand against mine as she passed by. It was subtle enough that anyone watching wouldn't notice, but it was loud as hell to me. One evening, she texted me out of the blue. I was at home, my partner in the next room, and my phone buzzed with this notification that felt like a live wire in my hand. She wrote, "Hey, want to grab another drink after work tomorrow?" I stared at it, my heart racing, and a part of me was screaming to just ignore it. Delete it, block her number, do anything but engage. But my thumbs were already moving before I could think twice. Sure, sounds good. The next day felt like a countdown. I could barely focus on my work, knowing what was probably going to happen later. Every time I'd catch Emily's eye across the office, she'd have this little smirk, like she already knew she had me wrapped around her finger. It was the worst kind of thrill, the kind that eats away at you from the inside, but I couldn't pull myself back. After work, we went to a different bar this time, one even further from the office, somewhere I knew I wouldn't run into anyone I knew. As we sat there, the conversation started light again, but there was this charged tension, both of us kind of skirting around what we both knew was going to happen. We didn't talk about our lives outside of this. No mention of partners. No talk about where we'd be going when the night ended. It was like we built this little bubble where none of that existed. Eventually, we left the bar, and I suggested walking back to my car, even though it was a good 10-minute walk away. I just didn't want the night to end yet. And of course, she fell in step beside me, close enough that our shoulders brushed with every other step. Neither of us spoke as we walked, just this heavy, loaded silence. I kept my hands in my pockets, resisting the urge to reach out, but I could feel her presence like a magnet. When we got to the car, I unlocked it and turned to say something, but she didn't let me finish. She closed the distance between us and kissed me, and all that tension from the past few weeks snapped. It was like the world fell away, like I'd been waiting for this, needing this, in a way I hadn't let myself admit. We ended up in the back seat, both of us moving like we couldn't get close enough fast enough. It was messy, intense, a blur of heat and hands and whispered words that I can't even remember now. I knew, even then, that this was a line I couldn't uncross. But in that moment, I didn't care. I felt like I was on fire, like all the parts of me that had gone numb over the years were suddenly awake again. I don't know how long we stayed there, tangled up in the dark, but eventually, we both came back to reality. She straightened her clothes, gave me one last look, and slipped out of the car without a word, just that same little smirk as she closed the door. I sat there for a while, breathing hard, feeling the weight of what I'd just done settle into my chest. I kept thinking this was supposed to feel worse, but instead, there was this strange sense of relief, like I'd finally scratched an itch that had been driving me crazy. I knew I'd messed up, but some twisted part of me felt satisfied. When I finally went home, I tried to act normal, slipping back into my routine like nothing had happened. But I could feel the lie sitting there between us, this invisible wall I'd built in one reckless night. Every time my partner looked at me, I'd get this pang in my chest, like I was both desperate for them to know and terrified of what would happen if they found out. But I managed to keep it together, to act like nothing had changed, even though everything had. That night, lying in bed, I kept replaying the whole thing in my head, like it was burned into my memory. And that's when I realized that this wasn't going to be a one-time thing. Once you cross a line like that, it's almost impossible to go back. That's something no one really tells you. Or maybe they do, and you just don't believe it until you're in it. After that night with Emily, I could feel myself getting pulled deeper, even though I knew I should be fighting against it. But every time I told myself it was the last time, I'd think about her, the way she looked at me like I was someone else, someone more interesting than the version of myself I'd grown so used to. I was hooked on that feeling, as messed up as it sounds. The next time we saw each other at work, she acted totally normal. No smirks, no extra attention, nothing. For a second, I actually thought I'd imagined the whole thing. But then, around lunchtime, my phone buzzed with a text from her. Coffee break? That was it. No winky face, no hints, just a simple question, and yet my pulse shot up like I was a teenager again. I met her at a cafe a few blocks away. We both got coffee, sat at a corner table, and pretended like we were just co-workers, catching up on work gossip or whatever. But every time our eyes met, there was this tension underneath, this silent acknowledgement of what we'd done. At one point, she leaned in close, under the guise of saying something private, and her hand brushed against mine. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a jolt straight to my gut. I was already done for. We didn't talk about us. We didn't talk about my partner or her life outside of work. We just kept it in this bubble, this space where none of those things existed. It made it easy to keep going, to keep ignoring the consequences. And somehow, that only made the attraction stronger. When we got back to the office, she gave me one last glance, that half smile she knew would drive me crazy. and disappeared down the hall. I spent the rest of the day barely able to focus, counting the minutes until I could see her again. And soon, just once more became a regular thing. We'd meet up after work, sometimes for drinks. Other times we'd find some quiet, tucked away corner of the city where we could just be together without any judgment, without anyone knowing. It was like living a double life, and I got good at it. Too good, honestly. I'd go home after these meetups, greet my partner with a kiss, ask about their day, and act like I wasn't carrying this huge, awful secret. Looking back, I'm not even sure why I felt so entitled to this whole setup, like I could just have my cake and eat it too. I think part of me genuinely believed that I wasn't hurting anyone, at least not yet. I told myself that as long as no one found out, it wouldn't affect my relationship. That somehow I could keep this whole thing contained like it was in a glass box I could put away whenever I wanted. But the truth is, it was already bleeding into everything. I started finding little things about my partner that annoyed me, things I'd never even noticed before. It was like being with Emily had reprogrammed my brain, made me notice all these tiny flaws and irritations at home that hadn't bothered me before. I'd get snippy over nothing, or find excuses to be out of the house more often. My partner would look at me, concerned, asking if everything was okay, and I'd brush it off, saying I was just tired or stressed from work. And then there was Emily, constantly on my mind, this intoxicating escape from real life. With her, I didn't have to think about bills or chores or whose turn it was to buy groceries. It was just easy. I could turn my brain off, be someone else for a while, someone who wasn't weighed down by all the responsibilities I'd taken on without even realizing it. One night, after another late meetup, I came home to find my partners sitting on the couch, waiting up for me. They looked up when I walked in, their face half in shadow, and I got this pang of guilt so strong it almost knocked the wind out of me. I stood there trying to act casual, but they didn't say anything, just stared at me with this tired, searching look that made my stomach twist. "Where were you?" they asked, their voice low and calm, but with that edge that meant they already knew I was lying about something. "Just work stuff," I said too quickly. My voice sounded off, even to me. "Went for drinks after with the team. Just a long day." They just nodded, still watching me, not buying it for a second. And in that moment, I realized how badly I'd been messing with the one steady, solid thing in my life. This person who'd stuck by me through all my flaws, who trusted me, was sitting there, piecing together something they didn't even want to believe. I wanted to come clean right then and there, just let it all out, but I was too much of a coward. I couldn't even bring myself to look them in the eyes. Instead, I muttered some excuse about being exhausted, gave them a half-hearted kiss, and went to bed. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, feeling like the worst person in the world. I kept thinking, maybe this is the point where I stop. Maybe this is the wake-up call. But even as I told myself that, I knew it wasn't true. Because the thing is, I didn't want to stop. It happened on a night that should have been completely ordinary. The kind of night where you make 100 little choices that seem unimportant until, suddenly, they aren't. I'd been with Emily again that evening. We'd gone to the usual bar, had a couple of drinks, nothing crazy, but enough to put me in that familiar haze. We didn't even do much, just talked, but even that felt dangerous. Like every word was another step over a line I'd already crossed. She asked me if I wanted to come back to her place, and some part of me was itching to say yes. But the weight of it all had been building up lately, creeping up on me in those quiet moments, making me feel like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. I could see how shaky the ground was beneath me. That night, for whatever reason, I decided I needed to go home to try and be there present for my partner. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe I just felt the walls closing in, but I declined her offer, which surprised her. I remember her giving me this look, a mix of confusion and disappointment. I just shrugged it off, said I'd see her at work, and walked out. The drive home was only supposed to be 20 minutes. I was replaying the whole night in my head, barely even looking at the road. The radio was on low, just some soft background noise, but I couldn't tell you what song was playing. My mind was tangled up, looping through this mess I created, trying to convince myself I could still find a way to fix it, even though I didn't know how. It was late, the streets mostly empty, and the rain had started coming down harder. Just enough to make the roads slick, but not enough to really catch my attention. I remember glancing at my phone, which had just lit up with a message. My first thought was that it was Emily, maybe a follow-up text, something like, "Are you sure you don't want to come over?" But it wasn't her. It was my partner, asking where I was, telling me they missed me, asking if I was okay. And there was that gut punch reminder of the person who actually cared about me, who was sitting at home waiting, none the wiser. I don't know what I would have said if I would have lied or told them I was on my way, but I never got a chance to answer. One moment, the road was clear. The next, there were headlights blinding me, coming in way too fast from the side. I barely had time to react before the impact hit. This violent jolt that rattled through me like I was a puppet with my strings cut. Everything went white, then black, then a chaos of sounds. Metal crunching, glass shattering, the echo of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. When I came to, I was slumped against the seat, my head throbbing, the smell of gasoline and burnt rubber thick in the air. The car was tilted at a weird angle, and my chest felt like someone had pressed a hot iron against it. I looked down and saw that the airbag had gone off, and for a moment, I just sat there, disoriented, trying to piece together what had happened. It took me a few minutes to realize the other car was still there, maybe 10 feet away, another crumpled mess of metal and shattered glass. I could see someone moving inside, a shadowy figure, but everything was hazy, my vision blurring in and out. I fumbled for my phone, which had fallen onto the floor somewhere, and eventually found it. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911, the words tumbling out, barely coherent. When the paramedics and police arrived, they asked me questions, things I could barely process. My mind was still stuck on that text, the one from my partner that I hadn't answered, like it was some kind of omen I'd missed. I remember them helping me out of the car, the world spinning as I tried to stand, my legs like jelly. They checked me over, asked if I'd been drinking. I told them I'd only had one or two, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. At some point, someone must have called my partner. I don't remember the exact moment they showed up, just this blur of lights and voices, and then the sight of them standing there, looking terrified, like they'd already started grieving. They rushed over, arms around me, asking if I was okay, tears in their eyes, and I wanted to disappear. Because in that moment, all I could think about was the mess I'd made, the lies I'd told, and the fact that I was here, standing in front of the person who cared about me, while someone else had just been pulled from the other car on a stretcher. They kept saying how lucky I was, how grateful they were that I was okay, and I felt like a fraud, a walking shell of a person who didn't deserve any of this sympathy. The paramedics said the other driver would be all right, that they'd taken them to the hospital as a precaution, but all I could see was the twisted metal and the glass on the road, like pieces of my life scattered everywhere. That night, when we got home, my partner sat me down, wrapped me in a blanket, kept checking on me like I was fragile, like I might break. They kept saying, "I'm so glad you're okay. I don't know what I'd do if something happened to you." And the whole time I just sat there nodding, feeling like the worst kind of person, the kind who takes everything good in their life and twists it into something ugly. I'd like to say that was the moment I finally woke up, that I realized how deeply I'd screwed everything up and vowed to change. But the truth is, that night just left me feeling hollow. I knew I had to end things with Emily, that I'd been handed a second chance I didn't deserve. But there was still that part of me, that selfish, reckless part, that wondered if I could keep both worlds going, if I could somehow fix things with my partner without giving up the thrill I'd found with Emily. That's the thing about choices. They don't just haunt you. They shape you, turn you into someone you barely recognize. And by the time I finally pulled myself out of that wreckage, both literal and metaphorical, I wasn't sure there was anything left worth saving. In the days after the accident, everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. My partner was hovering around me constantly, making sure I was okay, asking if I needed anything. They were gentle, patient, almost suffocating in their concern, and it only made me feel worse. I was torn between guilt and this strange sense of relief, like I'd been jolted awake from a dream I didn't know I'd been living in. But even with that near miss, I couldn't bring myself to come clean. The whole ordeal with the car accident gave me the perfect excuse to distance myself from Emily, though. I'd come to work with bruises still healing on my chest from the seatbelt, moving slower, wincing every time I bent down to pick something up. Everyone in the office knew what had happened, so there was no reason to explain why I was avoiding her. I could just act like I was too shaken up to do anything but get through the day. Emily kept her distance at first, though I'd catch her glancing at me from across the room with this look, like she could sense I was pulling away. And I knew she wasn't stupid. She had to see what was happening. It was like we both understood the unspoken decision that had been made, even if neither of us had said it out loud. but I could feel her watching, waiting for me to make a move. One afternoon, about a week after the accident, she finally cornered me in the break room. Everyone else was either at lunch or out of the office, so we were alone. She didn't waste any time, just looked at me with those piercing eyes of hers and asked, "Are we done?" I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell her yes, that I was done, that I was going to fix my life, make things right with my partner, and try to be the person I thought I was before I met her. But standing there, looking at her, all those old feelings came rushing back, tangled up with regret and a twisted sense of longing. It's hard to explain. There was this part of me that still wanted her, that still craved the escape she offered, even if I knew it was poison. I don't know. I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. I could feel the weight of my own indecision pressing down on me, and I hated myself for it. Emily's face softened a bit, like she could see the conflict inside me. "Look, I get it," she said. "That accident, it shook you up, made you think about things." She paused, searching my face. "But don't use it as an excuse if you don't really want to end this." Her words hit me like a slap. She was calling me out, refusing to let me take the easy way out by blaming it all on the accident. And she was right. The accident had given me clarity, sure, but I knew deep down that if it hadn't happened, I'd still be sneaking around, living this double life, lying to my partner with a smile on my face. I wanted to blame the circumstances, but the truth was, I was the problem. I can't keep doing this," I said, looking down at the floor. "It's not fair to them. It's not fair to you." She crossed her arms, her expression guarded. "So that's it then? You're just done?" I nodded, feeling like I was on autopilot, like someone else was speaking through me. "Yeah, I think I have to be." She didn't argue, didn't try to convince me otherwise. She just gave me this sad smile, like she'd been expecting this all along, and walked out of the break room without another word. And just like that, it was over. The silence she left behind felt heavier than any argument or goodbye. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. But it didn't last. Breaking things off with Emily was only the beginning. It didn't erase everything that had come before it. My partner was still there, still looking at me with that gentle, concerned expression that made my stomach twist. And I was still lying to them, pretending everything was fine, like I hadn't been carrying on this affair right under their nose. The guilt kept gnawing at me, wearing me down day by day. It got to the point where I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror without feeling disgusted. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, with this constant loop running in my head of every lie I'd told. Every time I'd look my partner in the eyes and pretended I was faithful. Every promise I'd made that I'd already broken. It was like the accident had cracked something open inside me, something I couldn't close up again. One night, I came home late after a work event, an actual work event this time, though I'm sure I still smelled like whiskey. My partner was sitting on the couch, waiting up for me, looking exhausted. They didn't say anything, just watched as I kicked off my shoes and slumped down beside them. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable, until finally they spoke. "Are you happy?" they asked, their voice barely more than a whisper. The question caught me off guard. I looked over at them, seeing the worry in their eyes, the quiet fear they'd been carrying around for God knows how long. And I realized that, on some level, they knew. Maybe not the specifics, maybe not about Emily, but they could feel the distance, the way I'd been slipping away. They weren't stupid. They'd probably been piecing it together for months. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. How could I possibly explain everything? How could I tell them about the emptiness I'd been feeling, the mistakes I'd made, the parts of myself I barely even understood? I wanted to say yes, to tell them that of course I was happy, that we were fine, but the lie felt too heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Instead, I just shook my head, my throat tight, and whispered, "I don't know." We sat there in silence, both of us staring at the floor, neither of us brave enough to say what we both knew was coming. They reached for my hand, held it in theirs, and I felt this pang of something between love and shame, like I'd failed them in a way I could never fix. I thought maybe they'd start asking questions, that they'd press me for answers I wasn't ready to give. But they didn't. They just held my hand, and we sat there, both of us pretending we didn't feel everything crumbling beneath us. That was the moment I realized there was no easy way out. No clean break, no fresh start that would make this right. I'd made my choices, And now I had to live with them, for better or worse. And the worst part was, even with everything laid bare, I still couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. I was too scared of losing them, even though I'd already lost myself. The next day, I woke up and went through the motions, putting one foot in front of the other, trying to act normal. But deep down, I knew I was standing on borrowed time, that someday soon, all of this would catch up to me. And when it did, there'd be no one to blame but myself. After that night, things shifted between us. I don't know if my partner ever suspected the full truth, but they definitely sensed that something was broken. There was this quiet distance between us, like we were each on opposite sides of a chasm that had opened up out of nowhere. We still did the routine things, cooked together, went to family gatherings, spent weekends running errands, but everything felt hollow, like we were just going through the motions, both of us pretending that things were okay when we both knew they weren't. I kept telling myself I could fix it, that if I just tried hard enough, I could make this right somehow. So, I doubled down. I planned date nights, bought them little gifts, even started going to the gym like I could somehow make myself into a better partner, one who deserved them. It was this desperate attempt to bury the past, to make up for everything without actually admitting what I'd done. I wanted to be better, but I didn't have the guts to be honest. For a while, it seemed like it was working. My partner started to soften, the tension in our house loosened up a little, and I almost believed we'd found a way to move on. I think they wanted to believe it too. Maybe they were just as afraid of what would happen if we really confronted what was wrong. Maybe they'd chosen to look the other way, or maybe they really didn't know. I'll never be sure. And then, out of nowhere, Emily reached out. It was just a text. A simple, stupid text that sent my stomach spiraling the second I saw her name flash on my screen. I hadn't heard from her in weeks. We'd managed to avoid each other at work, kept things strictly professional, and I'd assumed that was the end of it. But there she was popping back into my life with a single message that was as casual as it was devastating. Hey, just checking in. Hope you're okay. That was it. No drama, no anger, just Emily. Like she hadn't torn a hole in my life. Like she hadn't been the one I'd risked everything for in some stupid, selfish bid for excitement. I stared at the message for a long time, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to delete it, to block her number, and never think about her again. But another part of me, probably the same part that got me into this mess in the first place, couldn't resist. I wanted to know what she wanted, if she was really just checking in, or if there was something else, some hidden reason she'd reached out now, just when I was finally starting to find some kind of balance again. Against my better judgment, I replied, "I'm okay. Thanks for asking." I figured that would be the end of it, just a quick exchange to let her know I was fine, and then I'd move on. But she replied right away, "Do you want to grab a coffee sometime? Just to catch up?" I knew, in that moment, that agreeing to see her would be a huge mistake. I knew it, and yet, I couldn't help myself. There was this part of me that still wanted to see her, to hear her voice, to feel that old spark, even though I knew it would only drag me back into the mess I was trying so hard to escape. So, I told myself it would just be coffee, just a simple conversation, nothing more. I told myself that I'd go, get whatever closure I needed, and then finally put this all to rest. We met at a coffee shop on the other side of town, far from where I usually went. It was a little place I'd never been before, cozy and dimly lit, with jazz playing softly in the background. I got there first, ordered a coffee, and sat by the window, watching the rain drizzle down outside. It felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life, sitting there waiting for a woman who wasn't my partner. When Emily walked in, she spotted me right away and smiled. That same, familiar smile that had pulled me in from the start. She looked calm, like she didn't have a care in the world, like the whole thing had never affected her the way it had ripped me apart. She sat down across from me, ordered a tea, and for a few minutes we just made small talk. Work, weather, the usual. It felt almost normal, which only made it worse. Eventually, she looked at me, her eyes steady, and said, "Are you happy?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I could feel the weight of it, all the layers underneath. She wasn't just asking about my mood or my day. She was asking if I was happy with my life, with the choices I'd made, with everything that had led me to this moment, sitting across from her in a coffee shop where no one knew me. And the worst part was, I didn't have an answer. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. She nodded, like she understood. "I don't know if I am either." There was a long silence after that, both of us just sitting there, avoiding each other's eyes. I think in that moment, we both realized how much damage we'd done, not just to the people in our lives, but to ourselves. This thing between us, it had been thrilling, sure, but it had left us both hollow in ways we hadn't anticipated. We'd filled each other's emptiness for a little while, but now all that was left was a deeper kind of loneliness, one that couldn't be fixed with stolen moments or secret meetings. "I'm sorry," I finally said, though I didn't even know what I was apologizing for. For starting this? For ending it? For not knowing how to fix the mess we'd made? She gave me a sad smile, the kind of smile that felt like a goodbye. Me too. And that was it. We finished our drinks, made a little more small talk, and then she left. No dramatic farewell, no promises to stay in touch. Just two people who'd made mistakes, trying to figure out how to move on from them. I sat there in that coffee shop for a long time after she left, just staring out the window, watching the rain. I kept thinking about my partner at home, about the life I'd almost destroyed over a fleeting feeling that had left me emptier than I'd ever been. I'd been given so many chances to come clean, to make things right, but I hadn't. And now, I wasn't sure if I even knew how to. When I finally got home, my partner was waiting for me, their face lighting up when I walked through the door. They asked me how my day was, and I gave them some vague answer, feeling that familiar weight of guilt settle over me. But this time it was different. This time, I knew that if I didn't do something, if I didn't make a change, I'd lose everything that mattered. So, I took a deep breath, looked them in the eyes, and said, "There's something I need to tell you." My partner looked at me, their expression shifting from surprise to worry as they saw the seriousness in my face. I could feel my heart pounding, the weight of everything I'd been hiding pressing down on me all at once. There was no easy way to say it, no gentle way to soften the blow. I'd been rehearsing this moment in my mind for weeks, but now that it was here, the words seemed stuck in my throat. They sat down on the couch, watching me with this mix of fear and patience, like they already knew this was going to be bad. I sat down across from them, taking a deep breath, and forced myself to just start. "I haven't been honest with you," I said, my voice shaking. I've made some really bad choices, and I'm so sorry." Their face didn't change at first, but I saw their shoulders tense. I kept going, even though every word felt like a knife twisting deeper into something I'd already broken. I told them about Emily, about the late nights, the lies, the months of sneaking around. I didn't go into detail. I couldn't bring myself to do that, but I laid out the truth, raw and ugly. I didn't spare myself or try to make excuses. I just let it all out, feeling more exposed than I'd ever been in my life. When I was done, there was this heavy silence between us, the kind of silence that feels like it's stretching on forever. I could see the hurt in their eyes, the shock giving way to anger and disbelief. They looked down at their hands like they couldn't even look at me, and I felt this sick, hollow ache in my chest, knowing I'd put that look on their face, knowing I'd been the one to take away whatever trust they'd had in me. "Why?" They finally whispered, their voice barely audible. I didn't have a good answer. I wanted to tell them it wasn't their fault, that it wasn't about them, but I knew how hollow that would sound. I knew it wouldn't make any of this easier to bear. I'd been selfish, reckless, chasing some feeling that I thought would fill the emptiness inside me, only to end up more empty than before. But those were just words. None of it changed what I'd done. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I really don't know. I think I was just lost, or I don't know. I messed up. I'm so sorry." They shook their head, biting their lip like they were trying to keep from crying. I reached out, wanting to hold their hand, to comfort them, but they pulled away, and that hurt more than anything else. I could see the wall going up, the distance forming between us, and I knew I'd done this. I'd built this wall with every lie, every choice, every time I looked them in the eyes and hid the truth. They took a deep breath, their voice steady but shaking at the edges. "Do you even love me?" That question hit me harder than I expected. I did love them. Of course I loved them, but I betrayed them in ways that love was supposed to prevent. I could say I loved them all I wanted, but my actions had shown them something different, something darker. I looked down, feeling ashamed, and nodded slowly. "Yes, I do. I love you more than anything." They laughed bitterly, a sound that was more painful than any anger or shouting could have been. "You have a funny way of showing it." We sat there, both of us not knowing what to say, the weight of everything just hanging in the air. I wanted to fix it, to make it better somehow, but there was nothing I could say that would erase what I'd done. I'd broken something that might never be whole again, and I knew it. I dragged them through my own mess without them ever knowing, and now they were left holding the pieces. After what felt like hours, they looked up at me, their eyes red, and said, "I need some space. I can't even look at you right now." They stood up, grabbed their keys, and walked out the door without another word. I sat there in the silence, the reality of what I'd done finally sinking in. They were gone, and I had no idea if they were coming back. Part of me wanted to chase after them, to beg them to stay, to promise I'd be different, better. But I knew that would only be for me. I knew I had to let them go, give them the space they needed, no matter how much it hurt. That night was one of the longest of my life. I stayed on the couch, staring at the door, hoping they'd come back, knowing deep down that they probably wouldn't. I thought about texting them, calling them, anything to let them know I was sorry, that I'd do whatever it took to make things right. But I stopped myself, realizing that I'd already taken so much from them. The least I could do now was give them the time to figure out what they wanted. Days passed, and the silence from their side of the bed, the empty seat at the kitchen table, the absence of their laughter, it all started to consume me. I'd go to work, come home, sit in the quiet, and replay every mistake, every lie, every selfish decision that had led to this. I realized that I had no one to blame but myself, that I destroyed my own happiness in this reckless pursuit of something I didn't even understand. Eventually, they came back just to pick up a few things. They didn't say much, just moved around the apartment with this careful, distant expression, like they didn't want to be near me longer than necessary. I tried to ask them how they were, try to say something, anything that might bridge the gap between us. But they just shook their head, their face pale and exhausted, and told me they needed more time. And so, I waited. Weeks passed, and I tried to focus on work, on hobbies, on anything that might fill the void. I kept telling myself that they'd come around, that maybe this was just a phase, that maybe love would be enough to fix it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I'd put a crack in our foundation, and no amount of love could fully erase the betrayal I'd carved into our relationship. One evening, they finally came back for a real conversation. They sat down across from me, looking calm but resigned, and said, "I don't think I can do this anymore." I felt my stomach drop, the finality of it hitting me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to plead with them, to tell them I'd change, that I'd do whatever it took to earn their forgiveness. But the look in their eyes told me it was already too late. They'd made their decision, and I was going to have to live with it. We talked quietly about logistics, about who would stay in the apartment, who would take what, how we'd tell our friends and family. It was surreal discussing the end of something that had once felt so solid, so unbreakable. And through it all, they stayed calm, composed, even as I felt myself falling apart. When they left that night, it was like a chapter of my life had closed, and I was left alone with nothing but the consequences of my own choices. I'd wanted excitement, something new, something that made me feel alive. And in chasing that, I destroyed the one thing that had truly mattered. Now, months later, I'm still trying to pick up the pieces, trying to understand how I let myself become this person, how I allowed my own selfishness to ruin something so good. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand it, or if I even deserve to. All I know is that I'll carry this with me, a reminder of how easily you can lose everything you love by chasing something that was never worth it to begin with. It's strange, the things you notice after a breakup, the little reminders that linger in ways you don't expect. After my partner moved out, I'd keep finding things that felt like echoes of them. A stray sock, a favorite mug they'd left behind, a book on the nightstand with a folded corner marking their place. Every time I found something like that, it was like reopening the wound all over again. I thought I'd get used to the quiet, but it never really happened. The apartment felt too big, too empty. I'd come home from work, and there'd be no one there to ask how my day went. No one to cook with or complain about the day's frustrations. I'd sit on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, telling myself I should be doing something productive, but always ending up doing nothing at all. Just waiting for a text from them that I knew wasn't coming. Some nights, I'd lie awake, wondering what they were doing. If they were seeing someone new, if they'd managed to find the happiness I'd robbed them of. The thought was torture, but I couldn't stop myself from spiraling into it. I had so many things I wanted to say, so many apologies I knew would never be enough. I'd hurt them in a way that couldn't just be smoothed over with words. And even though I was the one who'd betrayed them, it still felt like they'd taken something vital from me when they left. I tried therapy. I knew I had things I needed to work through, patterns I needed to understand if I was ever going to be better, to be someone worth loving again. Sitting there, talking to a stranger about everything I'd done, all the ways I'd sabotaged my own happiness, it was like peeling back layers I hadn't even realized were there. I'd always thought I was in control, that I understood myself, but the truth was I'd been avoiding my own reflection for years. Therapy forced me to look in the mirror, to confront all the things I'd buried. My therapist asked questions that felt simple but cut deep. Questions about why I'd sought out something outside my relationship in the first place, why I'd risked something so good for a thrill that faded as quickly as it came. I didn't have answers, not really. I tried to explain that it wasn't about my partner, that it was some restlessness inside me, some feeling that I was missing something. But saying it out loud made it sound hollow, pathetic. All those reasons I'd justified to myself. They fell apart the second I tried to put them into words. Maybe it was about avoiding real intimacy, my therapist said one day. Sometimes, people seek out affairs because they're afraid of being truly seen. They want the fantasy, the excitement, because real relationships, well, they require vulnerability, consistency, a willingness to stay even when things get hard. Hearing that stung, because deep down I knew they were right. I'd wanted the fun, the spark, without any of the work. And when things got too real, too familiar, I'd run. I'd run straight into someone else's arms instead of confronting my own fears, my own flaws. I'd used Emily as an escape, but what I'd really been running from was myself. I spent months working through that realization, trying to understand how I'd let myself become so shallow, so selfish. And little by little, I started to see that fixing this wasn't going to be about winning back my partner or even finding someone new. It was about becoming someone I could actually live with, someone I could respect. I had to stop looking for other people to fill the emptiness inside me and start dealing with the reasons it was there in the first place. One day, out of nowhere, I got a text from my ex. Seeing their name on my phone screen made my heart skip, this mix of hope and dread flooding through me. I hadn't heard from them since they moved out, and part of me had assumed I never would. The message was short. I'd like to meet and talk if you're open to it. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I didn't know what they wanted to say or if I was ready to hear it. But I also knew this was a chance I couldn't pass up. So I replied, told them I'd be there, and we agreed to meet at a cafe halfway between where we each live now. When I walked in, they were already there, sitting by the window, looking out at the street with that familiar expression I used to know so well. Seeing them again felt like a punch to the gut. They looked different, lighter maybe, like they'd found a way to let go of all the pain I'd caused. And while I was glad for them, it made me realize just how much I'd lost. I sat down, fumbling for words, but they spoke first. I'm not here to rehash everything, they said, their voice calm but firm. I've made peace with it. I need to know if you have too. I swallowed, feeling a lump in my throat. I'm trying, I said honestly. I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back. I've been working on myself, trying to understand why I did what I did. They nodded, looking down at their coffee. I spent a long time wondering what I did wrong, they said softly, trying to figure out if there was something I could have done to keep you from going to someone else. Hearing that broke me. It wasn't you, I said, my voice shaky. None of it was your fault. You were everything I could have asked for. I wasn't ready to be the person you deserved. I thought I was, but I was lying to myself as much as I was lying to you. They looked up at me, their eyes softer than I deserved. I appreciate you saying that, they said quietly. But I think deep down I always knew. You were restless. Maybe I ignored it because I didn't want to believe it, but I felt it. We talked for a while, both of us careful, measured, like we were walking on glass. I told them about therapy, about the things I was working through, the ways I was trying to change. They listened, nodding, but I could tell their mind was already somewhere else, already moved on in ways I was only beginning to understand. At the end of the conversation, they looked at me with this sad, gentle expression and said, I hope you find what you're looking for. I really do. I don't hate you. I think I just needed time to realize that I'm better off without someone who couldn't be honest with me. Hearing that hurt, but I knew it was true. They'd given me everything, and I'd taken it for granted, let my own selfishness and insecurities destroy something that could have been lasting. And now I was paying the price. We hugged goodbye, this strange, bittersweet embrace that felt like closing a book I'd loved and ruined at the same time. They walked away without looking back, and I watched them go, feeling that familiar emptiness settle in my chest. But this time it was different. This time I wasn't going to run from it. I went home that night, sat in the silence of my empty apartment, and let myself feel the weight of everything. The regret, the loss, the realization that some things can't be undone. And for once, I didn't reach for a distraction. I didn't text anyone, didn't call friends, didn't drown myself in work or pointless scrolling. I just sat with it. I let myself feel the consequences of my choices, the hurt I'd caused, the person I'd become. And in that painful silence, I promised myself that I'd never make those mistakes again. Because if there was one thing I'd learned, it was this: happiness isn't something you could chase. It's something you build piece by piece through trust, honesty, and the kind of work I'd been avoiding my whole life. And maybe, just maybe, someday I'd be ready to try again. This time as someone who understood what it meant to truly care for another person and who wasn't afraid to be honest, no matter how uncomfortable it got. But until then, I'd be here, facing myself in the quiet, finally ready to do the work that I should have done all along. It's been a year now. A year since that last conversation with my ex. A year of sitting with the reality of everything I'd done and the person I'd become. In some ways, I'm still in the same place, same apartment, same job. But inside, things have shifted. I don't even recognize the person I was back then, the one who took so much for granted, who let themselves get swallowed up by ego and impulse. Therapy's been humbling. Every session, I'm faced with parts of myself I'd rather ignore, patterns that run deeper than I'd ever realized. It turns out the affair wasn't just a fluke or a phase. It was the culmination of years of avoidance and insecurity. When I look back, I can see the signs in other relationships, other choices I made, all leading me to that point. The truth is, I'd spent most of my life running away from anything that felt too close, too vulnerable, because a part of me didn't believe I was worth sticking around for. There's no big revelation, no aha moment that suddenly made everything clear. Just a slow, painful process of learning how to be honest, with myself first, and hopefully someday with someone else. Therapy taught me that trust isn't just something you give to another person. It's something you have to build within yourself first. Without that, I was always going to sabotage any chance at real intimacy. I don't talk to Emily anymore. We had a few awkward interactions at work after everything fell apart, but eventually, she transferred to a different department, and we drifted out of each other's lives. I think she understood, on some level, that I was never really what she needed either. We were both using each other as a temporary fix for something broken inside. I hope she finds what she's looking for, just like I hope I will one day. As for my ex, I haven't reached out. I've wanted to more times than I can count just to see how they're doing, maybe to hear that they've found happiness or closure. But I know it's not my place. They deserve to move on without me dragging them back into a painful chapter they've probably worked hard to close. They deserved better, and it's on me to respect that. Sometimes the best apology you can give someone is just letting them live their life without you in it. I won't lie and say I've found peace. Some days are easier than others, but there are still nights when I lie awake, replaying everything, wondering if there was a way to change the outcome. I know that sounds pointless, but it's like the mind has its own way of punishing you, making sure you don't forget the pain you caused. I still catch myself avoiding mirrors sometimes, avoiding my own reflection, as if I can hide from the part of me that did all that damage. But I'm learning to sit with it, to accept that this is part of who I am now. The choices I made, the people I hurt, they're a part of my story, but they're not the whole story. They don't have to be. A few weeks ago, I ran into an old friend who hadn't seen me in years. We caught up over coffee, and eventually they asked about my ex. I hesitated, not sure how much to say, but eventually I just told the truth. Told them I'd messed things up in a way I couldn't fix. My friend just nodded, didn't judge or offer me pity, just accepted it for what it was. And then they said sometimes we learn things the hard way. The important part is that you learned. Maybe they're right. Maybe there's no redemption, just learning. Learning to be better, even if you can't change the past. Learning to forgive yourself, even if you're not sure you deserve it. And learning to let go of the fantasy that life will ever feel as simple or easy as it did before you messed up. I'm trying to rebuild one step at a time. I've started going out again, trying to reconnect with friends, making an effort to be present in a way I hadn't been for years. I still have that restlessness in me, that urge to chase something new, but now I recognize it for what it is, an escape. And instead of running from it, I'm learning to sit with it, to understand that real happiness doesn't come from thrill or excitement. It comes from consistency, from commitment, from showing up for the people you care about and for yourself, even when it's hard. Maybe someday I'll find love again. But right now, that's not my focus. Right now, I'm focused on becoming the kind of person who can be trusted, someone who doesn't need to chase outside validation or quick thrills to feel alive. I want to be steady, honest, someone who can look in the mirror and actually feel proud of what they see. If there's anything I've learned from all this, it's that rebuilding takes time. Healing isn't a straight line. It's messy, with setbacks and nights that feel endless. But each day, I'm a little closer to who I want to be. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. This isn't the ending I'd have chosen, but it's the one I created. And now, it's up to me to make something of it. To keep going even if I don't know where the path leads. Because if I've learned anything, it's that the journey forward starts with being honest about where you've been and choosing every day to be better. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow.